Starting off with our first one that I know when I've talked to different people around the state, don't even know Idaho does it. House Bill 617, Idaho's Needle Exchange Program. Yes, you heard me right there. In 2019, Idaho joined states like California, Oregon, and Washington in implementing a syringe needle exchange program. It was hoped that the program would reduce the transmission of blood-borne illnesses among drug users. However, it has sparked a contentious debate across the state, with critics arguing that it inadvertently subsidizes and perpetuates drug addiction. Also, that it doesn't solve the root problem, but rather ensures that individuals can continue their drug use under the guise of safety. Thus, House Bill 617 has come to try to get rid of the program, in the spirit of saying that taxpayers don't want their dollars to go to clean needles, and that the most loving thing to do is not to remove consequences for people's actions. Which, with that said, what exactly is the program?
So the program was designed to provide clean needles to drug users to prevent the spread of blood-borne illnesses such as HIV and Hep C, which is a really good thing. Those are bad diseases. That said, they should only provide clean needles and shouldn't actually help addicts with using the needles, which is also a good thing. We don't need nurses shooting up our addicts. That's probably not a thing we want to be paying for. The reason for this is that last month on February 16th, a report came from the East Idaho News about one of the Idaho harm reduction projects being rated for drug paraphernalia, which then caused the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare to announce an internal review of their working with IHRP. According to a spokesperson from the Boise Police, officers seized electronic devices and packaged drug paraphernalia. So there are problems with this. Tyler, what does this bill actually say that's going to solve the problem, though?
Well, for once, I will say the Idaho legislature has outdone themselves, and they've written a very short bill.
What?
Yes, it can be done, and here is an example of it.
Nice.
The first part of the section of the bill says Chapter 34, Title 37, Idaho Code to be, and the same is thereby repealed. So basically saying we're going back to what we had before. No needle exchange program. That's what we want. Second section, number 2, an emergency exists therefore, which emergency is thereby declared to exist. This act shall be enforced and effective on and after July 1st, 2024. So basically, if it gets into effect, there has to be a due date. This has to get removed. 2 parts, just go back to what we originally had, and we have to do it by set date. But for those that are for the program, they generally argue around the area that it reduces the spread of infectious diseases, as we talked about earlier, between people who are injecting drugs, and is a soft landing to connect people with other treatments to hopefully get them out of their addiction to other health services and different stuff. And that's the argument for those for it, but what's the argument for those against it?
Yeah, those that argue against this say that it does encourage people to stay addicted. Or maybe it's not encouraging people, but it does make it easier for others to get addicted by taking away one of the risks that happen with doing those types of drugs. Not to mention that most people don't actually seem to want their tax dollars to be paying for clean needles for drug addicts. That's not necessarily a thing we want to be paying for.
Yeah, it's like saying I'm willingly going to help make sure there's more cookies in the cookie jar for the child I know that keeps stealing them and overeating on them. No, I don't want to do that. But I mean, purely on that stance of the money part of it. We can go back and forth about the ethical, which we will get into that more, but on the base level, the people, as we've talked about other times, should have a voice in where their tax dollars are going to. It's their money, it's getting put into the government, and we live in a representative government, and so they should have the right to say, I want that and I don't want that. I don't have a poll to cite, but I'm pretty confident in Idaho, especially because you see how the rest of our drug laws are in the state. We don't like people doing drugs, and we don't want to encourage it. So I really doubt the average person either 1 knows or 2 wants this type of thing to be happening with their money.
Well, given the fact that marijuana is still illegal here in Idaho, which, you know, take it or leave it, I'm kind of ambivalent on marijuana as a drug in and of itself. But the fact that we in Idaho still have marijuana be illegal makes me think that we probably don't want hard drugs to be legal or to be accessible. Just based on that fact that marijuana is illegal, we don't want people doing drugs.
Right.
So, yeah, I can definitely get down with not spending money on clean needles for addicts. Now, that does bring up the question, though, of how do we help people? Because one of the things that we do want, and one of the things that we're called to do as people, is how do we help those that are vulnerable? And you mentioned it earlier, it starts with parenting, I think, where we need to teach and train our children to not be addicted to things and then be able to discern right from wrong and good from bad. Mm-hmm. And as true as that is, that doesn't actually solve the problem of the addict. That might solve part of the problem of the next generation, but that doesn't solve the problem that we currently have right now. And so while I do agree that not having diseases like hepatitis C or HIV transfer as much, I agree that's a good thing. I don't know if this is something that our government should be should be spending money on, especially if we can't point to studies that say that these diseases are spreading at rates that are
threatening to the fabric of our communities.
Right. And they're threatening to the general population. Now, if we were having a hepatitis C outbreak where everybody and their brother were getting this disease, then yeah, we would want to take drastic steps to stop this problem from continuing and really try to figure out what the root causes are.
Right. And from what I've been reading, and also, you're not regularly seeing hospitals crammed with people for something like that, right? I think that would also be a testament. It's discouraged to do drugs. But similarly, on that vein, it seems like, if I'm being generous, both sides are coming from a loving place. They look at the addict and say, you're a human being, I have some decency for you. One side says, you just need to stop doing the drugs, which I get it. It can be hard to do. Any addiction is hard to break, right? But there's the other side that says, well, the addiction's hard, and we're not going to try to figure out per se how to solve the addiction, but we are going to at least make it so that while you're trying to work through that addiction, you don't horribly get yourself with a disease or something. And in a sense, both of those come from a loving place in theory. But I think at the core of it, you need to really look, what is the most loving thing to do for a person? I think it's something that also applies to so many other topics in our society and that we've kind of forgotten in our modern modernity, is that sometimes the most loving thing to do for a person is to tell them the truth, not to pull away the consequences from them. This is a very stark example, and I don't want to be called for doing straw man, but I'm trying to make my example, and I'll boil it down to something more practical. But if you have a friend, or not even a friend, just a human being, that they are actively running towards a cliff, the most loving thing for you to tell that person is you're running off a cliff and you shouldn't do that, and you should get in their way to stop them from running off the cliff. Now, for this example, the person might be sitting there and saying, no, I want to go off the cliff. I want to go off the cliff. It doesn't matter about that they have consent to run off the cliff. They're an image bearer of God, and we're supposed to protect human life. And so you're to stop them from running off the cliff. So bringing that all down here with similar things, one side, they want to alleviate the diseases, but part of the reason that disease occurs, that root cause, is because they have an addiction. And that is one of the consequences of that vice. And so I would say we should address the root cause of, one, how do they get addicted, or to help them get out of their addiction. And not only that, for people outside of that might be tempted to not remove the consequences, because sometimes there's people that wouldn't even get into that vice. But if you remove the consequences of an action, example with the person running off the cliff, instead of stopping them from running off the cliff, but you just make a nicer pillow at the bottom of it, so there's a higher chance when they jump off the cliff they won't die, you haven't solved the problem then. The most loving thing is to help them at the beginning part, one, to be like, no, you shouldn't run off the cliff. And secondly, if you have run off the cliff, to give them that medical attention when they're at the bottom of it.
Right. Well, I think there's two questions in play. The first one, I think, is a really easy question to answer, and it's this. What is the purpose of our government? Right. And I think the purpose of our government, and we've talked about this ad nauseum, the purpose of our government is, one, to protect us from foreign adversaries, and two, to provide us civil stability. That's about it. Those are the things that our government should be doing. They are protecting us from outside. They're protecting us from inside the country. They are ensuring that our God-given rights are protected. Now, right. Do you have a God-given right to pump drugs into your system using a clean needle that's provided for you by someone else? No, I would say not, because that's saying that you have a God-given right to someone else's something, which that's not how rights work. So for the first question, is this something the government should be doing? I don't think this should fall under the purview of the government. That's thing number one. Question number two, though, is exactly on the line that you're talking about. And so if we want to help people that have addictions, if we want to help people that are mentally unstable, one, who should be doing that? And two, how should that be done? So the answer to the first question, I think, honestly, and you look through history, I think that typically falls to the church. We talked about this on last week's show. Who is it that actually gives money to nonprofit organizations? Well, it's Republicans. Now, I guess, we're talking about overlapping Venn diagrams here, but who are the people in the Republican Party that give money to charity organizations? I don't have any information to back this up, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's Christians by and large. So who are the people that are actually giving money to support causes? Well, it's Christians. Right. Or at least it's churchgoers. But those are the organizations that should be there to provide that help for people that need that help. That's the job of the church. And so then the question becomes, okay, so it's not a government job. It is a church's job. How does the church actually help these people? And you answered the question, I think, really well, is you don't solve the problem by solving the consequences. You don't heal a giant cut by just slapping a Band-Aid over it and hoping it heals. And then you peel the Band-Aid back and you go, oh no, it's festering. So you put that Band-Aid back and then you slap another Band-Aid over it. And then next week you peel it off and you go, oh, it's even worse. So you put that back and now you cast the arm. Covering up a problem isn't actually solving the underlying issues. You've got to get in there and you've got to clean out all of the junk that's in that cut that's infecting it before the cut can actually heal. And I think this thing is true with this. We have to ask why. Why are people addicted? What is it that people are running from? Why is it that people are drawn to these things? And then we can help people after that. But it goes back to who should be doing this work and then how should it be done? Right.
And springboarding off that, I think there would be way less controversy, especially, I didn't specifically put it in the notes here, but it is something I'm going to point out. The program that is doing this for the state is a nonprofit in a sense that the state is funding to be the middleman for it. But if a nonprofit is doing this and people are actively choosing to give their money to that thing, then that's one thing. It's another thing when the state as a whole is going and funding these programs and different things that I would personally argue aren't good for the fabric of society. They don't encourage virtue. They don't encourage you to be an independent individual that's trying to be productive in society and add to the general fabric of your community. This is just trying to be like, oh yeah, there's that consequence for that action you shouldn't have done. The government's going to make it a lot softer for you. And I guess that also pulls into my last point that I teased earlier on. We shouldn't remove the consequences for bad actions, but rather we should make it harder for people to do bad things. And if they do, we should help them with the consequences after it, and how to not have or do that thing again.
I agree with you to a certain extent, but it comes down again to the question of who should be doing that work. And I don't think the government should be doing that work. If this is something that is truly plaguing our society, then our society needs to be the ones that do this work. Because we've seen time and time again that government doesn't know how to solve problems. It's ill-equipped to handle, and so getting as much out of the hands of our government as we possibly can seems like it's a good idea.
At least having the institutions that are designed to handle those things do it. The government has its role and its function. There's the role of government and the role of the church. And can the government try to do the role of the church? Well, yeah, you can.
But it can try.
It's not going to go well. We should use things for their intended uses. And I would argue that the intended use and role of the church and the community is more for this rather than the government.
We covered that a little bit earlier. We said, what is the purpose of government? Government has a purpose, and we want that purpose to be there. I would agree with you. We're not anarchists here. We need a government. The government is an institution that was designed and crafted by God, given to man for our betterment. So yes, government is important, but government has a sphere in which it works. And outside that sphere, it doesn't work well.
And so all that comes together, I wanted to talk about this because the more I talked about this or briefly mentioned it, a lot of people did not know this was going on, even if this was a program in Idaho. And to let you guys, one, know that this discussion is happening, and then two, it's also passed the House as of the reading of this story. And if I remember correctly, either first reading in the Senate or first reading in committee for the Senate, and that's coming Friday, March 8th. So if this is something that you agree with us on and you want this bill to move forward and for this program to be repealed and to go back to what Idaho was before 2019, then write your senator, reach out to them, let them know. It's all the goal that we have here is stay informed. Or if it's something that you really are passionate that you want that program, we haven't swayed you, then there again, please be involved, make your voice heard in that sense.